You know that feeling, being certain you're right, while everyone around you is just as certain you're wrong. The people who know you best laugh first, not out of cruelty, just habit. You keep going anyway, quietly, because some part of you already knows something they don't yet. What happens next isn't what you'd expect. Here's where it begins. By the second week of October, the smell reached the county road before the orchard itself came into view. Not the clean, sharp scent of a fresh-cut apple. This was heavier, fermented. The smell of fruit that had been lying in wet grass far too long. Under the rows of trees behind the Tarn farmhouse, thousands of bruised and split apples lay scattered across the mud. Some had come down in a windstorm the week before. Some had simply ripened too fast and dropped before anyone could reach them. A young woman in a mud-streaked coat crouched near one of the piles, turning an apple over in her palm. Her name was Della Tarn, and she was 24 years old. And by the end of that fall, half the county would know her name for reasons that had nothing to do with apples at all. It had rained 9 days out of the last 12. Every time a tractor rolled into the orchard, its tires sank into the softened ground and left ruts deep enough to hold standing water between the trees. So the apples stayed where they fell, and every day more of them joined the pile. Fruit flies gathered in clouds above the rot. Yellow jackets moved through the split skins, and mice had begun testing the fence line near the barn. Della had grown up on this ground. Her grandfather planted the first rows in the late 1940s, back when the orchard was barely 20 acres and the farmhouse still had a hand pump in the kitchen. By the time she was 10, she could tell a Baldwin from a northern spy before the color had fully set. By 14, she could drive the old flatbed tractor down a row of trees without clipping a single trunk. By 16, she wanted nothing to do with any of it, and she said as much to anyone who asked. She left for a 2-year agricultural program at the county college the fall after she turned 18, telling her father she wanted to study something useful, by which she meant something that wasn't apples. In her final term, an instructor assigned a project on farm waste, the things a place like theirs paid to haul away every season. Spoiled produce, cold vegetables, manure nobody wanted sitting too close to the house. The assignment asked one simple question, and it was a question that stuck with her long after the grade came back. What if the things a farm called waste were only waste because nothing on that farm had been given a use for them yet? She thought about the orchard the whole way home that spring. Every year, no matter how careful the harvest crew was, a portion of the crop never made it into a box. Her father called the apples that fell before picking a sanitation problem, something to be swept up and hauled off before it drew trouble. Della had started seeing something else. She saw calories going to waste in the wet grass. She saw insect habitat nobody was managing. She saw nutrients that had come out of this same soil, grown into fruit, and were now simply being carted away from the farm that grew them. And she saw the flock of laying hens her mother kept behind the barn, eating store-bought feed, producing manure that had to be collected and hauled somewhere useful, laying eggs that sold well enough at the Saturday market, but never seemed to connect, on paper, to anything else happening on the property. On paper, the orchard and the hen house were two separate operations. In Della's head, they had started to look like two halves of the same machine that nobody had ever bothered to bolt together. Elwood Tarn had farmed this ground since he was younger than his daughter was now, and he had never once considered chickens to be an orchard tool. Chickens belonged in the coop behind the hen house, laying eggs for the Saturday market, not wandering loose beneath his father's apple trees. When Della first mentioned the idea at the kitchen table in early March, he set down his coffee and looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post that has started leaning the wrong direction. She had a hand-drawn map spread across the table, the orchard divided into small numbered sections. She explained it plainly. The birds would clean up dropped fruit, chase down insects, knock back the weeds crowding the tree rows, and leave manure behind instead of hauling it in from somewhere else. Elwood studied the map for a long moment before he spoke. "How many birds?" he asked. 500, eventually she said. He set his cup down, harder than he meant to. "You want 500 chickens loose under my apple trees." "Not loose," she said. "Managed. Moved. Fenced in sections, same as cattle on rotation." He reminded her they already owned equipment for orchard cleanup. She reminded him that equipment needed dry ground to run, and dry ground was not something October in Oak Hollow reliably provided anymore. He reminded her they had sprayers. She said sprayers didn't clean fallen fruit off the ground. He reminded her a little louder now that they already had chickens, and chickens belong where chickens belonged. Della opened a folder she had been keeping since January. Inside were notes from a county extension agent, a rough budget for portable fencing and water lines, a schedule for how many days a flock could stay in one section before the ground became overworked, and a plan for moving the birds out of any block well ahead of the next harvest. She had not come to the table with a feeling. She had come with a plan. Elwood asked what it would cost to set up properly. She told him. He laughed once, not because the number was funny, but because it landed exactly high enough to be irritating. He pushed the folder back across the table and told her that a folder full of numbers wasn't the same thing as a business. It's a trial plan, she said. That's another way of saying you don't know if it'll work, he answered. She agreed that was fair. That's why we tested small, she said. 12 acres. Just the north block. He was quiet for a long time, tapping one finger against the table. Finally, he said she could have a north block for one season. She would track everything herself: feed, fuel, labor, damage, eggs, and if the birds tore up root systems, drew in predators, or caused any kind of trouble with the neighbors, they were gone, and she would be the one to move them. She agreed to every condition before he finished listing them. He added one more thing. He would not, under any circumstances, be caught chasing chickens through his own orchard. That part turned out not to be true. Word of the plan reached Silas Bragg before the first bird ever left the truck. Silas had advised orchards and grain farms across the county for the better part of 2 decades. He sold crop treatments, helped growers plan spray schedules, and could name every insect that troubled an apple tree faster than most men could name their own cousins. He was not a fool, and he was not unkind. He had helped more than one farm survive a bad season. But he believed a problem should be solved with something you could measure, schedule, and apply at a known rate. 500 chickens did not fit cleanly into that kind of thinking. He brought it up at the spring growers meeting in front of nearly 30 farmers from 3 townships. "You're doing what?" he asked, loud enough for the back row to hear. "Running hens through the orchard after harvest," Della answered. Silas took a slow drink of his coffee. "You starting a petting zoo out there, Della?" A few men laughed. She didn't. "They'll eat the fallen fruit," she said. "Chase down the insects hiding underneath it." "Chickens don't read pest management plans," Silas said. "They don't know which bugs you want gone and which ones you don't." "I know that," she said. "They'll scratch up the ground around the roots. That's part of the plan. They'll leave droppings everywhere. Also part of the plan." Silas looked past her toward Elwood, standing near the back wall with his arms crossed. "You're allowing this?" 12 acres, Elwood said. "Just to see." Silas turned back to Della. "There's a reason the big commercial orchards 2 counties over don't manage pests with chickens." "What's the reason?" she asked. "Because there are better tools available." "Better at what?" she asked. Silas didn't answer that one directly. She had heard that kind of answer plenty of times before. Better usually meant faster, or cheaper on paper, or simply more familiar. A tool could be better at one thing and worse at 5 others, and nobody liked being asked which 5. "We'll have numbers by winter," she said. "Bring them," Silas said, smiling like a man who did not expect to see any. The trial started the last week of September, right after the north block came off the trees. Della split the 12 acres into small paddocks with portable electric fencing, moved a mobile coop into place on wooden skids, and hauled in a water tank on an old flatbed trailer that had been sitting behind the barn since before she was born. Every morning before sunrise, she opened the coop door, and the birds came pouring out in a noisy brown and white wave. For the first day, they stayed close to the coop, unsure of the open ground. By the second day, they had found the apples. A chicken does not eat a whole apple the way a person does. It pecks. It opens the skin, takes a small piece, moves to the next. Other birds gather. Within minutes, a fallen apple stops looking like fruit and starts looking like scattered fragments pressed into the wet grass. Insects that have been hiding beneath the rot scatter into the open, and the birds chase them down before they get far. By the third day, The ground under the trees looked different. The piles were no longer piles. What remained had been broken apart, eaten, or worked down into the soil. But nothing about 500 chickens runs without trouble. 2 water containers went over in the first week, knocked flat by birds crowding around them at once. A hawk found the flock on day 4 and took one hen before Della could get out the door with a length of pipe to scare it off. A section of fence lost power when wet grass touched the lower wire, and 37 birds wandered straight into the next paddock before she noticed. She spent an hour and a half coaxing them back with 2 feed buckets, and words her mother later said had no business being used near the customers who sometimes wandered by. Elwood watched most of it from a truck. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it, right up until one panicked hen ran directly between his boots, and he found himself chasing chickens through wet grass for the better part of 20 minutes, muttering the entire time about folders and numbers and how a man's own daughter had talked him into this. Word traveled fast along the county road. More than one truck slowed to a crawl passing the orchard fence that first week, drivers craning their necks at the sight of chickens moving in a loose, scattered herd beneath the apple trees like nothing anyone in Oak Hollow had seen before. One neighbor pulled his truck all the way onto the shoulder and sat there a full minute before driving on. That evening, Elwood got 3 phone calls. One man asked whether the birds had gotten loose from somewhere. Another asked, only half joking, whether his daughter had lost her mind. The third caller just laughed for a while and hung up without saying much else. Della's mother, Ruth, kept mostly quiet about the whole arrangement, though she made her opinion known in smaller ways, showing up at dawn with a second thermos of coffee, mending a torn section of fence without being asked, standing at the kitchen window, some mornings just to watch the flock spread out under the trees. When Della apologized one evening for the mud tracked through the kitchen for the 3rd day running, Ruth only said that a floor could be mopped and left it at that. By the end of the first month, Della had changed the layout 3 times. She added covered feeders so the rain wouldn't spoil the grain. She moved the water trailer more often after learning how quickly the birds churned the ground around it into mud. She shortened how long the flock stayed in each section, learning through trial that a few days of scratching helped the soil, while too many days stripped it bare. Through all of it, she kept records. Every bag of feed, every gallon of fuel for the little tractor that pulled the coop, every hour of labor, every dozen eggs collected, every fence repair, every bird lost to a hawk or a fox. She laid sampling squares in both the chicken block and a nearby comparison block left to clean up the old way, counting fallen fruit before and after the flock passed through, photographing the bare ground, noting how long the hired hand spent on cleanup in each section. Some mornings the work was almost peaceful. She would stand at the edge of a paddock with a mug of coffee going cold in her hand, watching the flock spread out beneath the trees in the low gray light. The only sounds the scratch of claws through wet leaves and the occasional soft argument between 2 hens over the same piece of fruit. Other mornings tested every ounce of patience she had. A fox took 2 birds in a single night during the 2nd week, slipping under a section of fence that had sagged after days of rain. She spent an entire Saturday afternoon burying the fence wire a foot deeper along that whole stretch, her hands raw and cold by the time she finished, Elwood silently helping without either of them mentioning it out loud. The hardest part wasn't the predators or the weather. It was the waiting. A tractor finished a job in an afternoon and moved on. The flock worked slowly, a little more ground cleared each day, the results only visible if you were willing to look at the same stretch of orchard morning after morning and notice the small differences. Della started keeping a second notebook just for that. Not numbers, just short lines about what the ground looked like each day, so she'd have something to point to when her father asked, as he often did that first month, whether any of this was actually working or whether she just liked chickens. Somewhere in the middle of one long, muddy afternoon, resetting a water line for the 3rd time that week, Della found herself thinking past the fence in front of her toward the shape of the whole operation. Most farms treated the things they couldn't sell as a cost to be hauled away. The fallen fruit, the spoiled grain, the manure nobody wanted near the house. But a cost only stayed a cost as long as nothing on the farm had a use for it. The orchard had fruit nobody could sell. The flock needed forage and ground to work. Somewhere between those two facts sat an answer nobody had bothered to look for, because looking meant admitting the old arrangement had a gap in it. She wondered how many other gaps on this farm had simply been accepted as the way things were, never once questioned by anyone standing close enough to see them. Then the rain started again, and the thought went back into the mud where it belonged, at least for the time being. By late October, the smell along that stretch of fence line had changed entirely. Where the orchard once carried the heavy, fermented note of rot sitting too long in wet grass, the north block now smelled of turned earth and crushed leaves, closer to a plowed field after a spring rain. Then an orchard in decline. Even Ruth commented on it one evening, standing at the edge of the yard with a basket of laundry on her hip, saying she hadn't smelled that particular smell since she was a girl helping her own father turn compost behind the barn. At first, it was ordinary fall rain. Then another system came through behind it, and another after that. The ground turned soft everywhere except the paths the birds had already packed down. Water gathered between the rows in the comparison block, where the old piles of fallen fruit sat untouched, growing heavier and more sour by the day. Elwood decided to run the sweeper through the comparison block before the weather turned any colder. The tractor made it less than 50 yards before the rear tires sank to the axle. He reversed, and the tires spun uselessly, throwing mud in a wide arc behind the machine. By the time he and a hired hand dragged the tractor free with a chain and a second truck, the ruts were deep enough to hold standing water like small ponds. He stood beside the mud-streaked tractor for a long moment, looking down the road toward the north block, where the flock moved steadily beneath the trees, unbothered by any of it. They didn't need dry ground. They didn't need diesel or traction. They needed to be fed, watered, and moved, and they kept working through weather that had stopped his best machine cold. Della came to stand beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Behind them, a hen shook rainwater from her feathers and went back to scratching at the base of an old tree. Over the following 10 days, the rain kept most of the heavy equipment parked in the barn. In the north block, Della kept rotating the flock section by section, rain or no rain. In the comparison block, the fallen fruit stayed exactly where it had landed, and the smell only grew stronger. The difference was no longer something anyone had to take her word for. It was standing in plain sight along the fence line that split the two blocks. The north block was not spotless. Della never claimed it would be. There was still fruit scattered here and there, still a few weeds the birds hadn't reached, still the occasional cluster of flies near a low spot. But the fruit that remained had been broken down, worked into the ground, or eaten outright. The piles were gone, and every bit of that fruit the flock had processed had come back to the farm as eggs, or as manure spread evenly across ground that would carry the trees through another year. When the trial period ended in late November, Della moved the flock back to their winter housing and sat down with every page of her records. She didn't start with a conclusion. She started with costs. The fencing had run higher than she budgeted. Labor had been heavier in the first 3 weeks, while everyone was still learning the rhythm of moving birds and water and feed together. The mobile coop needed 2 separate repairs after wind damage. The flock hadn't replaced mowing entirely. It hadn't eaten every apple, and it certainly hadn't made the spray program unnecessary. But the chicken-managed block had needed far fewer mechanical cleanup passes. Less damaged fruit had been hauled off the property entirely. The flock had eaten less purchased feed during the heaviest weeks of foraging, since so much of their diet came straight from the orchard floor. Fuel use in that block had dropped sharply, mostly because the tractor simply hadn't been able to get in there at all. Egg production held steady through the whole trial. When she added up the value of the eggs, the fuel not spent, the feed not purchased, and the fruit that never had to be loaded and hauled away, the season had very nearly paid for its own startup costs in year 1, not counting the fencing and coop, which would carry over and keep paying for themselves every season after. In January, she brought all of it to the same growers' meeting where Silas had asked if she was starting a petting zoo. He sat in the second row this time, notebook already open on his knee. Elwood sat near the back, arms crossed, the way he always stood at these things, though something in his posture had changed since spring. Della started with the failures, not the winds. The lost hen. The escaped birds. The two ruined water containers. The sections where the ground had been scratched harder than she liked. She explained exactly how the flock had been timed to leave each block months ahead of the next crop, and how a veterinarian and the county extension office had both reviewed the plan before a single chicken ever left the truck. Then she showed the numbers. Silas raised his hand before she finished. 12 acres isn't a commercial result, he said. No, she agreed. It's a 12-acre result. And you still use your spray program on top of it, he said. I did, she said. The birds didn't replace it. They replaced part of the cleanup, part of the fuel, part of the feed bill, and some of what we were paying to haul off the property. I'm not claiming more than what the numbers show. He asked about disease risk, about food safety, about what happened if a grower tried this without the same careful timing she had used. She answered every question the same way, plainly, without defending the flock as some kind of miracle, without pretending the system worked on its own, without close attention. A farmer near the aisle asked how much ground 500 birds could realistically cover. It depends how wet the ground is, how much forage is out there, and how often you can move the fence, she said. That's the wrong number to copy, she added. The right number is how small a trial you can manage well enough to actually learn something from it. Silas looked at his notes for a long moment before he spoke again. What about disease risk, he asked. Food safety. If somebody tries this without your timing, without your record keeping. We designed a schedule with the extension office and a veterinarian before the first bird went out, Della said. The flock was gone from every block months ahead of the next harvest, and every day of it is written down. Nobody should copy this without a plan, just as careful. That's not a small thing to ask of people, Silas said. No, she agreed. It isn't. He closed his notebook partway, then opened it again. And if the numbers hadn't worked out, he asked, if the birds had torn up the roots, or the ground had turned to nothing but mud and manure, then I'd have told this room exactly that, she said, and we'd have gone back to the sweeper. Silas nodded slowly, the closest thing to agreement he'd offered all winter. The room went quiet for a moment. Then someone in the back asked whether the equipment could be shared between a few farms. That question changed the shape of the whole conversation, and by spring, 4 families across 2 townships had put together a small pilot group with the extension office, each starting with a flock size to what they could manage rather than trying to match Della's numbers exactly. Silas didn't stand up and announce he'd changed his mind. He simply showed up to the first field meeting that spring with his notebook, and he stayed for the whole thing. 2 seasons later, when a young farmer 3 townships over asked him whether chickens belonged in an orchard, Silas answered before anyone else in the room could. Depends what you're asking them to do, he said, and left it there, on the Tarn place. Della expanded the rotation to 28 acres the following fall. The fencing went up faster the second time. The water system ran the way it was supposed to. Elwood stopped asking whether the birds belonged in his orchard and started asking which block they were headed to next. Not every farm in the pilot group found the same result. One family kept their flock in a single section too long and lost more ground cover than they gained back. Another underestimated how much a hawk could take from an unprotected flock in a single bad week. A third decided, after 1 season, that the labor of moving water and fence simply didn't fit their operation and went back to the sweeper without any hard feelings on either side. Della kept track of all of it, the failures alongside the wins, because a method that only worked when everything went right wasn't much of a method at all. Fuel prices climbed the following year, and feed costs climbed with them, and the numbers that had looked modest in that first cold trial suddenly carried more weight. A bag of feed not bought was worth more than it had been. A tractor pass avoided was worth more. A load of spoiled fruit that never had to be collected, hauled, and dumped was worth more than anyone had bothered to calculate 2 years earlier. The chickens hadn't changed. The arithmetic around them had. Years later, the North Block still looked from the county road like any other stretch of apple trees in Oak Hollow, bare rows in winter, green canopy in summer, a packing shed catching the afternoon light behind the farmhouse. But every fall after the last marketable fruit came off the trees, the same pattern returned. A mobile coop rolled into place near the first row. Portable fencing divided the ground into sections. A water trailer sat under a scrap of shade cloth, And every morning, several hundred chickens moved out beneath the trees in that same noisy brown and white wave. The fallen fruit never disappeared completely. It never would. But it stopped being something the farm simply paid to remove. On the last afternoon of that first full season, with the flock loaded back into the trailer for the winter, Elwood stood beside Della at the fence line, looking out over ground that was not spotless, but was active, leaves disturbed, small pieces of fruit scattered thin across packed earth, the trees bare and waiting for spring. He said, without looking at her, that when she first laid that folder on the kitchen table back in March, he thought she was trying to prove the old way of farming wrong. I wasn't, she said. Then what were you trying to do? He asked. She looked out at the rose a moment longer before she answered. I was trying to put the pieces of this place back in the same conversation. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he isn't ready to say he was wrong, but isn't willing to argue the point either. He glanced back toward the equipment barn, where the old sweeper attachment still sat parked against the far wall, and used since the second season of the trial. You still keep that thing running, he said. Sometimes, she said. And these, he said, nodding toward the trailer. Sometimes too, she said. He almost smiled at that, though it took him a moment to let it show. The orchard hadn't given up its tractors, or its spray schedule, or any of the tools that had carried the place for 3 generations before Della was born. What had changed was smaller than that, and harder to put into words at a grower's meeting. The farm had simply stopped asking any single tool to solve every problem on its own, and started asking instead what each piece of the place was actually good at. Then he latched the trailer door, and the two of them walked back toward the house together as the last of the daylight went gray over the orchard, the chickens settling in behind them for the night, the ground beneath the trees quiet and dark and already, in its own slow way, getting ready for whatever came next. Where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever kept quietly working on something everyone around you had already written off, the way Della did with those chickens, waiting for the day the results finally spoke for themselves? Tell us below. We read every single one. See you in the next story.